Shalom. Welcome to our next Midrash, the Torah portion for this week. This week we're in portion Vayera, which is Genesis chapters 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22. All chapters start to finish. It doesn't break off in the middle of a chapter. There's a lot going on in this portion. We see the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. We see the birth of Isaac and also the near sacrifice of Isaac. We see some more traveling by Abraham. So there's a lot happening in this portion. So I'm just going to point out, again, just a couple of the interesting things and maybe new things that I found looking at this portion this week and reading through it. So the first thing that caught my eye is when Abraham is talking to Yahweh about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he's essentially challenging Yahweh. I think this is the best way I can think of to say it. And he's asking, are you going to punish the righteous with the wicked? Or will you save the city if there's 50 innocent there? And Yahweh agrees, yes, I'll save the city if there's 50. And this conversation keeps going essentially until Abraham gets down to 10. Would you save the city for 10? And Yahweh says, no, I won't destroy the city if there's 10 righteous people there. This is happening in chapter 18. And what I find sad, but also very interesting, is that Yahweh does destroy the city. So that means not even 10 righteous people were found in this whole city. And if you look, it's actually 4 people who went out: Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters. And his wife didn't make it because she looked back. So really only 3 people were saved from this destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it just makes me think about today's world. I've often sat and thought, how many true believers are there out there? Are we numerous? Are we few? What's it going to be like at the end of days? How many people are actually going to be on that straight and narrow walk? And if it is anything like Sodom and Gomorrah, it's pretty dismal. But that was one city, and at the end of days, we're talking about the whole world. And so I only hope and pray that the amount of righteous that Yahweh can find when he comes again is more in the favor of the righteous than in the wicked, as the case with Sodom and Gomorrah. But that was just a really interesting and a very sad thing that I found when reading this portion. Now, the other thing that's interesting is these 2 visitors that come to Abram at Mamre, the terebinth of Mamre. This is where one of them tells him, a year from now, your wife Sarah is going to have a baby. And this is not the first time that Abraham received this prophecy. He actually received it in the last portion, which we talked about, because he laughed. That was the reaction that he had. And that was interesting to me because Sarah was the one who laughs in this portion, and she gets called out for it. And she tries to lie, saying she didn't laugh because she was scared. And then when Isaac is born, she names him Isaac because she's talking about laughing. And I think in this case, it's kind of a play. It's a play on the fact where, yes, she laughed when she first heard the prophecy, but also now she's laughing because it actually happened and she can barely believe it. And how joyful is she that she has this son with her husband Abraham. But that's not really the point I want to bring out. I just want to bring up the contrast where when the angels first arrived to Abraham, it says they were men. But in chapter 19, verses 1, they're arriving in Sodom, where they eventually go to the house of Lot, and here they're called angels. So I don't know what significance that has, but it is something that jumped out at me. So the first instance, they're called men, and the second instance, they're called angels. Now again, so in Genesis chapter 20, Abraham's journeying again, and this time he's in Gerar. And the same thing as before, he tells the people there that Sarah is his sister, not his wife. And now if you remember what happened last time, it was clear that was not a good thing to do. He made the king mad at him. Yahweh was threatening because someone else's wife was in the house. And so, I've read this before multiple times, and I've always thought, why didn't Abraham learn the first time? Like, why does he keep making this mistake over and over? And I always thought, well, we're the same way. Israel is the same way. It's just purely highlights our status and what we do. But then I saw something that I hadn't seen before, and it's almost like he had already decided, like, this is what he was going to do. So if you go to 20 verse 13, it says this. Now he's explaining to Abimelech, who's the king who's mad, why he did this. And he's saying, I'm afraid she's beautiful. And in verse 13 it says, so when God made me wander from my father's house, I said to her, let this be the kindness that you shall do to me. Whatever place we come to, say there of me, he's my brother. So it was like premeditated, planned out. This is his game plan, strategy. And it's like he's not deviating from it no matter what, even though it's not working out every time. Although, to be fair, I guess it's working out for him, just not for the people he visits. The other interesting thing that I caught up on was Abimelech. He's told by Yahweh that he's going to be killed because he's got another man's wife in his house. And he's like, wait a minute. Are you going to slay somebody innocent? Which really mirrors kind of what Abraham was asking the father earlier when he was asking about Sodom and Gomorrah. Are you going to kill the innocent with the wicked? So here Abimelech's saying, are you going to slay the innocent? He himself said, she's my sister. My heart was blameless. My hands were clean when I did this because I didn't know. And this is the father's response in verse 6. God said to him in the dream, I knew that you did this with a blameless heart, so I kept you from sinning against me. And if you keep reading, what you find out is he didn't touch her. So in other words, he didn't commit adultery with another man's wife, which is a sin. And I found that very merciful and very beautiful. And I've noticed this before when I've thought back on my walk. I was not raised in Torah. I was raised Catholic, actually, and then spent some time in the Adventist church. And so when I think back on my journey, getting closer and closer to the Father in Torah and observing his feasts, I can see areas where he's, without me even knowing what was going on, protected me and kept me from breaking part of his Torah, or preserved me and helped me to actually keep it. One of my favorite examples was I used to, in high school, go to church with my boyfriend's family, but they preferred to go on Saturday night because it was just a little more laid back. And I agreed, it was more laid back. I felt like the pastor was a little more conversatorial with the people. And so I was observing Sabbath and I didn't even realize. And so it's just beautiful things like that I've noticed. And I think other people probably have similar stories. And this really jumped out to me. It was like, I knew you were blameless, so I protected you from sinning against me. But here's the key. He's told him now the truth, that there is another man's wife in his house, and he says, you've got to get her out. If you don't, you'll die. And I think this kind of is a beautiful mirror of what we should do as believers when we receive more revelation. Christians aren't bad people. They're not doing stuff with bad intentions. They just don't know. But we must be careful. If we are told new revelation, we must take it and do the right thing with it. And there are a lot of Christian believers I know that find this very difficult. Change is hard. It's completely different from what they've known. Maybe they feel like they've been lied to, and that's devastating. But really the onus is on us. Once we know the truth, there's no excuses. And so we're putting ourselves in a dangerous position if we learn something from Scripture that we should be doing or that we shouldn't be doing, and we just keep going down our path because it's easier, or we like our traditions, or whatever it may be. And this doesn't just go for Christians, it goes for us who are already in this walk. I'm still learning. There's a lot of baggage and garbage that went in over the years that we're trying to flesh out. We live in a Western society, so we understand Scripture from a mindset that maybe needs to be adjusted a little bit. And so we're always learning. But if we're resistant to that and we take new revelation in and we don't act on it, then we better be careful, because then maybe God's not going to be so merciful that time. When the heart's blameless and you don't mean it and you don't know better, he's forgiving and he gives you an out. But he also lets you know, hey, you're sinning, stop it, or there will be consequences. And in this case, Abimelech made the right decision. He got Sarah out of his house and his household was healed. The women in his household before couldn't have children. God had sealed up their wombs. And once Sarah was out and she and Abraham were on her way, all the women in Abimelech's household were healed. Now, the other thing, the last thing I want to touch on is this concept that we've talked about already. Traveling, you stop at a place, you invoke the name of Yahweh. And this happens in chapter 21, verse 33. Abraham's traveling. And this is actually like the last part of the Torah portion. And he's in Beersheba. And he stops and he invokes the name of Yahweh. But what's interesting here is, unlike the past examples, he's not building an altar. He's building a tamarisk tree. And he's not just invoking the name of Yahweh, he's invoking the name of Yahweh, the everlasting God. So this title goes at the end, where usually in the past instances the phrase has been, it was there that men invoked the name of Yahweh, or there he invoked the name of Yahweh. It's always just been that and stopped there. So those were two things that were really interesting. The first thing I wasn't sure about is, why is he planting a tree and not building an altar? And I looked up the Hebrew definition. It really didn't clear things up for me. In fact, it said a lot of times this word for tamarisk is also translated as grove. And trees and groves were often used in pagan worship of other gods. And so I found it interesting that Abraham is doing something that could be seen as what the nations do to their gods, and he's doing it for Yahweh, which seems to not match up with what the children of Israel are told after they escape Egypt. They're told, when you enter those nations, don't worship me as they worship their gods. Tear down their idols. Get rid of their groves. And so I'm not really sure what's going on here, why Abraham has planted this tree or this grove of trees to Yahweh. There is the mention of the everlasting God, and so maybe this is like similar to what's happening in Egypt with the plagues. A lot of the plagues that rained down were to show Yahweh as sovereign over their gods. And so the plagues were specific to something dealing with the gods of Egypt, and it was showing that Yahweh was above them. And so maybe this is one of those situations where he's like, no, Yahweh's the everlasting God, and this is his grove, this is his tree. But I'm not sure. It would be, I'd love to hear if somebody else has some more knowledge on that or a different revelation, because it's curious, and then I'd like to know what it means. But I did look up a little bit more about tamarisk trees just to see what they are, and they are very common in areas with a high salt concentration, which, we've already heard about salt in this portion with Lot's wife. She turned around and looked back and turned into salt. But the very interesting thing about this tree is it's really desirable as a shade tree for relief from the heat, because it actually secretes salt at night, and then in the morning that salt will bring in water from the atmosphere, and that causes a cooling effect like air conditioning under the tree. And so it's a very desirable tree for resting under, for having shade. And so, I don't know, interesting piece of information about the tree. I don't know what the potential spiritual significance here could be. But that's what I have for this portion. So again, there's a lot that I didn't touch on, but I wanted to point out the things that were new to me that I hadn't heard about or learned about before. So I hope you enjoyed, and as always, feel free to make comments. If there's anything here that I mentioned that I'm still wondering about and you have some more information, I'd love for you to share it. Thank you, and shalom.